So I'd like to welcome everybody to the Hadassah Magazine online discussion group, a joint project of the magazine and the engagement division of Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America. I'm Lisa Hostine, the executive editor of the magazine. The discussion group, which began last year long before many of us had even heard of Zoom, and certainly before it became a way of life, was an opportunity to delve a little deeper into a topic that had been featured in the latest issue of Hadassah magazine. Tonight's topic, Votes for Women, Jews and the Suffrage Movement, is especially timely. It comes as we approach the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting women the right to vote. It also comes as the election season heats up and we look to the November elections, and as Hadassah itself is marking the 100th anniversary by participating in the nationwide movement to register women voters and mobilize a record-breaking number of eligible women to cast votes into 2020. The battle for women's voting rights was waged over decades, beginning in the middle of the 19th century. And while some individual states had already granted women the right to cast ballots, the national effort didn't gain traction until 1918, when President Woodrow Wilson was persuaded to support the proposed constitutional amendment. By May 1919, the House of Representatives had signed on, and the Senate followed soon after. The amendment became a reality when Tennessee ratified the measure in August 1920, becoming the 36th state to do so, fulfilling the requirement that 3/4 of the states, there were then 48, must be on board before a constitutional amendment becomes reality. I'd like to give a special shout out to Hillary Danilova, who I think is on this program, a regular contributor to the magazine, who wrote the cover story on this issue in such an engaging and insightful way. The beginning of her story lays out an interesting perspective, so I'm going to quote directly. "Some things never go out of style. Take the white suit. It looked as fresh at recent State of the Union addresses sported by a wall of congresswomen as it did 100 years ago when a coalition of Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, and African-American women donned the pristine hue to wage war against sexism and win the vote for women in August 1920 with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution." Of course, they weren't wearing a pantsuit then. They were wearing those lovely white dresses that we saw on the cover of the magazine. Much more interesting. And as America celebrates the centennial of female suffrage, Hillary wrote, this year, what's striking is how much today's female leaders have in common with our activist foremothers, many of whom were Jewish. A century before Twitter, theirs was a story replete with petty rivalries, political marriage of convenience, eye-catching antics, and tabloid-friendly arrests at demonstrations that wouldn't be out of place in 2020 America. Here to help us understand the Jewish dynamic of the suffrage movement, as well as its legacy today, is a very distinguished panel of leading American Jewish historians. These women are especially known for their scholarly work related to the history and experience of Jewish women in America. So we're really delighted and honored to have you all with us. I'd like to introduce the panel and also remind the audience that we will be fielding questions, so please write them in the Q&A section as you think of them. So the introduction. Pamela Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and received the university's highest award, Scholar/Teacher of the Year. Her recent book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the National Jewish Book Award's Everett Family Foundation Jewish Book of the Year. The paperback edition was published in late spring. Melissa Clapper is professor of history and director of women's and gender studies at Rowan University. She is the author of Jewish Girls Coming of Age in America, 1860 to 1920, Small Strangers, The Experience of Immigrant Children in the United States, 1880 to 1925, and Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, American Jewish Women Activism, 1890 to 1940, which won the National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies. Her newest book is Ballet Class in American History. And last but not least is Judith Rosenbaum, CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, a national organization that documents Jewish women's stories, elevates their voices, and inspires them to be agents of change. A writer, educator, and historian, Judith earned her doctorate in American Studies from Brown University with a focus on women, gender, and social movements. She teaches, lectures, and publishes widely on Jewish studies and women's studies. So again, welcome to you all. We're really delighted to have you. And I know there's just so much to talk about tonight. So I'm going to start by asking each of you for your take on the Jewish contribution to the suffrage movement. Give us some context and examples of where that involvement was most noteworthy. Pam, we're going to start with you.
Thank you. And first of all, Lisa, thank you for inviting me. And it's so great to be in conversation with you and with my colleagues. I'm going to start with a woman named Ernestine Potowsky-Rose because she was an early women's rights activist, and she was also an abolitionist, and she was in many ways anomalous because at the second National Women's Rights Convention in 1851, she roared that it was time that this country gave women the vote. But she's a maverick and stands out in so many other ways. She was born in Poland in 1810. She claimed she was a rebel from the age of 5. She claimed that she studied the Torah. When her father tried to marry her off, and he was going to use the dowry that her mother had left her when her mother had died, and he was going to use that money as a dowry, she claimed that she sued him in court so that he couldn't marry her off to a man she had no intention of marrying, and so that she could keep the money, which she then also claimed that she gave to him. So she left Poland. She's not part of this later big East European Jewish migration. She crosses Europe, ends up in England, learns English, marries an Englishman, becomes a free thinker, and in 1836 comes to New York. And what's important about her is that the very first thing that she does is she's not talking about suffrage, she's talking about married women's property rights. Because what we don't tend to remember is the many, many different ways in which women were restricted in American life. A woman who got married in 1836, her husband took over control of all of her property and all of the earnings that she would make afterwards in the marriage. And so Ernestine Potowsky-Rose rails against that and helps to get New York State to pass a Married Women's Property Act. And then as the suffrage movement gets launched in 1848 at Seneca Falls, when suffrage becomes the centerpiece of this declaration that declares that all men and women are created equal, and it has many, many demands that aren't only about suffrage, but suffrage becomes the centerpiece. She becomes this major advocate for women's suffrage. So and she's anomalous, she's a Jew. This is a movement that's very much a Christian movement, but she's embraced, and she apparently was an extraordinary orator. Only we could have had voice recordings of how she spoke.
No Zoom then, right?
No Zoom then.
Judith, what's your take?
So, one of the things that is notable is that when we talk about the suffrage movement, most of the time Jewish women's stories are not included. And part of the reason for that is that we tend to think of the suffrage movement, or sort of historians or the general narratives tends to think of the suffrage movement as primarily a middle-class movement. One of the things that Jewish women were able to bring to the suffrage movement was the kind of cross-class work that they had done in the labor movement. So women like Rose Schneiderman and Clara Lemlich and Pauline Newman, who we really know mostly as labor activists, were also suffragists because they saw the vote as a tool. The suffrage wasn't their first primary issue, but they came to understand very quickly that the kind of change that they wanted to make in working conditions and pay in women's lives, working women's lives in general, was going to be very hard to achieve without the vote. And they had been developing these relationships with middle and upper class women as allies in their labor movement fight. And when it came time for suffrage, they saw this as an opportunity to strengthen some of those relationships and really to be able to bring the women who were interested in suffrage into connection to some of the issues that affected working women. So you have someone like Rose Schneiderman, who is primarily, as I said, known as a labor activist, but was also an ardent suffragist. She was one of the founders of the Women Earners League for Women's Suffrage, along with Clara Lemlich. And she did some touring for the Ohio suffrage referendum in 1912. In fact, one of her famous kind of legacies is the phrase bread and roses. She said the worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. And she said that actually when she was talking to wealthier women and trying to explain what she was fighting for, which was, as she said, the right to live, not simply exist. She was fighting for things like education and recreation and leisure and beauty. But she understood that the ballot was going to be something that women needed to achieve all of those kinds of things. And so they really argued, there were many Jewish women who were able to make this argument that was different from the argument that some of the middle and upper class women were making around sort of connecting women's right to vote to their maternal duties. These working class women were saying that women needed the vote to secure kind of basic human rights like safe working conditions. And they were very important in places like New York, for example, where Rose Schneiderman was a key organizer in the drive for a referendum in 1917. She and Pauline Newman both worked as paid organizers for one of the big suffrage organizations. Interestingly, you know, they sometimes got in trouble from both sides. So someone like Clara Lemlich, who worked as a suffrage organizer, actually kind of lost that job because her radical politics didn't line up with the reform-minded vision of most middle-class suffragists. But then also there were Jewish working class women activists for suffrage who were also socialists, who were kind of taken to task by socialists who thought that suffrage kind of conflicted with their priority of class-based politics. So it wasn't easy for these Jewish women to kind of hold their place as working class activists who were interested in making that connection with suffrage, but many of them did it in a very articulate way and really helped build those cross-class relationships in the movement.
That's so interesting. You're both highlighting individual activists. Melissa, tell us about kind of the organizational perspective. To what degree were Jewish women or women's organizations or organizations in general aligned with this movement?
Well, one of the things that you see, and I just want to harken back to something that Pam said, there was a whole array of legal and social and political disabilities, that women suffered with and had since time immemorial. And so that getting the right to vote was not the only thing on that agenda, on the larger women's movement agenda. And one of the things that eventually started to move forward, and there was actually real progress in some fronts, like the Married Women's Property Acts that Ernestine Rose was involved with, things like opening up higher education to women. Many colleges opened to women, some places new schools, and some places older schools going co-ed after the Civil War. There were more professional opportunities. In fact, there were some professions that, as they were being developed for a variety of reasons, were women's professions like librarianship, and then after that, social work. So there was real progress for women on a lot of fronts. And one of the drivers of that was the women's club movement that developed starting in the 1870s, but that really took off in the 1880s and beyond. And you had women who were interested in a more public role than they currently had, but they also had to defend that a little bit. And one of the ways they defended it, in reference to something that Judith said, was this idea of maternalism. The idea that in order to do a good job as mothers, they had to have a public place, not just a private place. That they shouldn't just be confined to taking care of their children and their families in the home, that as women, because they had that experience as caretakers, they would be important advocates. They should be involved with public health or with public sanitation. This came to be known as municipal housekeeping, this kind of clever idea that we're the housekeepers at home, we should be the housekeepers out there too, in the cities, in the local government. And these arguments were quite successful. It's why many women were enfranchised in local and municipal governments or in school boards long before they got the right to vote for president of the United States. So the club movement included Jewish women. There were Jewish women in some clubs, although there was also some exclusion there. I'll come back to that in a minute. And starting in the 1890s, there was a series of the club movement started to operate in the Jewish world as well. A major example of this is the National Council of Jewish Women, which was founded in 1893 after a meeting at the Chicago World's Fair of 1893 that brought together all kinds of Jewish women at the Parliament of Religions there. And of course, Hadassah is another example of that. Not even a full generation later, Hadassah is founded as I'm sure many of people who are watching this will well know, in 1912, it's another example of a women's club. Now, women's clubs sometimes the word club was sometimes used to diminish what women were doing, but in fact, they were doing all kinds of things. The Chicago Women's Club, for instance, designed the sanitation system of modern Chicago. So they shouldn't get dismissed as just being club women. And in many Jewish women's organizations, there were questions about how to be involved with suffrage. The vast majority, I wouldn't say all, but a very significant, and maybe the vast majority is right, of Jewish women involved in the club movement were in favor of suffrage. They also saw it as instrumental. They believed in it as what used to be called the justice argument, that women deserved the right to vote just by being human beings and citizens. But they also had the expediency argument, the kind of thing Judith was mentioning, where in order to achieve their goals within their clubs and organizations, they needed the vote, and it would make things better for them. The thing is, though, that Jewish women's organizations in fact, never officially endorsed the suffrage movement, which seems odd. These organizations, the National Council of Jewish Women, the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, which started in 1913, Hadassah, these groups were crawling with suffragists. They were full of members who actively supported the suffrage movement and were activists. But the organizations did not endorse suffrage, and that is a big question of why. And my answer to that is anti-Semitism. There was significant xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism in the suffrage movement, and it made it difficult for a Jewish women's organization as a Jewish women's group to formally endorse suffrage, even though so many of the members supported it. And so the problems, that we, as you mentioned, the narrative of the suffrage movement has often been that it was white and middle class and Christian. That's not totally untrue, but it's also not entirely true. There were always many, many other groups involved, and they had somewhat tenuous relationships with the kind of mainstream suffrage movement, even as they supported it and were involved in it. So Jewish women's organizations were generally pro-suffrage, but without offering any kind of formal endorsement because of the way that Jewish women were seen by some of the suffrage leaders. And these were pretty significant issues that kept groups like the National Council of Jewish Women from formally endorsing suffrage.
I want to dig into that issue a little bit because it's fascinating. I mean, clearly, Jewish women have had to contend with anti-Semitism and the fight for women's rights from the suffrage movement to the second wave of the 60s and 70s till today, and some of the founders of the National Women's March. So, but Jews obviously weren't as secure back then as they are now, right? Certainly fewer in number and certainly, quieter and not as strong as a community in general. So did these women speak out at all against some of those issues of anti-Semitism, or did they just feel, the ones who were involved, or did they just feel that the eye on the prize, the end goal was so important that they just, at any cost?
They did speak out. I'll just give two quick examples. In 1895, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the founders of the suffrage movement, a very important activist, but she published something, or presided over the publication of something called the Woman's Bible, which, if it were published today, would still be an incredibly radical document. And when you read it now, it's almost breathtaking. It is an extremely radical document that blames religion and monotheism for patriarchy and therefore all the ills of the world, particularly women's being second class in every conceivable way. But the Women's Bible was also really actively, explicitly anti-Semitic. And the recently formed National Council of Jewish Women did send a small delegation to Elizabeth Cady Stanton to say, hey, what up with this? How can you possibly, this isn't right, why are you doing this? And the documentary record is a little sketchy. We know that the National Council sent this delegation. We don't know a whole lot from their perspective about what then happened. As Stanton tells it, she sent them away with a flea in their ear by reminding them that Jews say the prayer, Jewish men say the prayer that they're happy that they weren't created women. And according to Stanton, these women had nothing to say to that, and they went away. When they got back to their local chapters of National Council of Jewish Women, there was great consternation about this. And again, this is one of the reasons why National Council did not ever formally endorse suffrage. It should be said that Stanton was seen as radical by the entire suffrage movement. They completely disavowed this document. There were a lot of Christian women for whom this was a complete attack on their belief system. It's why Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not make it onto the silver dollar, but Susan B. Anthony did. Right? She was disavowed by the movement, not just by Jewish women. That's one example, though, where people did fight back. And another one has to do with New York. In New York in 1915, as in many states in the Northeast, there was a statewide referendum on suffrage, and it did not pass in 1915. In New York, it did in 1917. But in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, it did not pass in 1915. And Harriet Stanton Blatch, and yes, you heard Stanton again, that's Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, who in many ways was a more progressive suffragist who especially was attuned to the needs of working class women and had started several groups for working class suffragists. But she was very public in her dismay and said all kinds of nasty things about foreigners and especially Jews. And Lillian Wald, who was the founder of the Henry Street Settlement and visiting nurses and a major public health figure, spoke back out against that. And Lillian Wald she certainly had ties to the Jewish community, but was not heavily identified herself. Kind of in her Jewish identity was attenuated. But when she heard this attack, she took the lead in saying, how can you say this? And also it was just statistically and factually incorrect. The districts in New York that most heavily supported suffrage in that referendum, meaning the men who voted for it, were Jewish. So Jewish men actually voted more heavily for suffrage than any other group in the entire state. So there were instances of pushback, but as you say, there was also not the kind of confidence that maybe American Jews might feel today.
Interesting. So it wasn't
anti-Semitism.
I was just going to say it wasn't just Jews who felt just, a little discriminated against in the movement, Judith. There were others as well, right?
Certainly. I was just going to say that I think it's important to remember that at the time also anti-Semitism was fairly normalized in many contexts, right? So as Melissa said, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was sort of marginalized in the movement by the Women's Bible, but not because the Women's Bible was anti-Semitic, but because it was just like a radical feminist rereading of of the Bible, and that was seen as like very radical at the time, as it would be now. But there was a lot of sort of just genteel, accepted anti-Semitism that Jews were probably quite used to and didn't think that much about. I mean, may have wanted to distance themselves from, but it wasn't shocking probably to many people to hear that. It was very much part of the environment, the same way that racism was much more accepted and part of the environment in certain ways and more overtly. I mean, obviously it's still systemically part of our world, but and there were many ways in which that was the case within the suffrage movement as well.
I wanted to say something about the organizations and specifically about Hadassah, because as Melissa points out, in the United States, none of these women's organizations take a position on suffrage. But what is really stunning is that Hadassah does in the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, because right around the time that the suffrage amendment is being resolved in the United States, there's a move inside the Jewish community in British Mandate Palestine to form a governing body for the Jewish community. And what we know about that is that Jewish women in Palestine are getting elected in local community elections. But there's the expectation that women are going to vote for this constituent assembly that's going to plan this governing body. But then the problem is that the ultra-Orthodox and an Orthodox religious movement called Mizrahi, they try to undermine the entire process. And I won't go through all the machinations about it, but Henrietta Zold was in Palestine. This is the last quarter century of her life. She spends a great deal of time in the Jewish community there. And Henrietta Zold says that you cannot disenfranchise women. And then women from Hadassah, from the United States, start sending telegrams and writing. And ultimately, when this constituent assembly is finally formalized around 1925, ultimately they do agree that women in the Jewish community are going to have not just the right to vote, but actually grants them all civic and political rights as well. So Hadassah takes a stance, but it is after it's not going to divide them in the United States.
Interesting. And also, didn't Henrietta Zold's sister actually become very active in the suffrage movement as an individual?
Rachel Zold Jastrow was active in the suffrage movement, right. In Wisconsin, I think, was where she lived. Yeah.
Well, that also raises the question, because to what degree did one just figure out which position they were going to take? And I think there were some interesting examples of within families divisions and sisters rivalry determining which is the right position, pro or con. Melissa, you want to talk to that issue a little bit?
Okay. Well, there's examples of mothers and daughters that do support suffrage together, and I think Judith can tell us some of those stories. I know, but my favorite example, I think probably anyone who does a work on this period, the favorite example is Maud Nathan and Annie Nathan Meyer. These are two sisters. They're from a Sephardic family. They belong to the Daughters of the American Revolution. Their family ancestors came during the colonial period. They were founders of Shereth Israel, Sephardic synagogue in New York. And they grew up together. They had they had all the same experiences. For the most part, they both married pretty wealthy men. They both tragically lost their only daughters at a very early age. Maud Nathan, in particular, her daughter was, I think, 9 or 10. And then Annie Nathan Meyer's daughter died right after she got married. So they had a lot in common. However, they did not like each other. And they took very staunchly opposing sides in the suffrage movement. Maud Nathan was probably the single most prominent American Jewish suffragist. She was known both in New York, but all throughout the United States, and she was also involved in the International Women's Suffrage Alliance. She was a parliamentarian. She attended many international conferences. She translated into French and German. She was this very educated woman, very stately, very tall. She always made a point of being beautifully dressed because she wanted to make sure there was this idea that all suffragists were kind of mannish and homely and poor looking, and she wanted to, in herself, show that was not the case. But her sister, Annie Nathan Meyer, who, by the way, was a founder of Barnard College, so somebody who advocated very strongly for women's higher education, Annie Nathan Meyer basically said, well, if Maud says yay, I say nay. And she became really probably the most important Jewish anti-suffragist. And this was a spectacle. They debated each other. They wrote competing letters to the editor. They sometimes were on the same stage together, kind of fighting it out. I kind of feel like they, a little way, they might even have enjoyed that just a little bit, the kind of spectacle of it all. But they really, they opposed each other. They worked hard on opposing sides. And my take on this, like I said, is mostly that Annie Nathan Meyer was she was known to be a very, very intelligent, hardworking person, but difficult. She was known to be a kind of difficult person, although, of course, a woman who's known as difficult is not always difficult. So I should qualify this. But her family thought she was difficult, too, not just people from the outside. And as soon as women got the right to vote, it just needs to be noted that Annie Nathan Meyer immediately got involved with the League of Women Voters, which does raise questions about how sincere her activism against suffrage was. So they're a kind of fun couple to look at, and I feel like they knew it and they played it up a little bit.
Interesting. You allude a little bit to some of the tactics and strategies. I mean, from what we can tell, there was just a lot of colorful activity. So can any of you talk to, what were some of the really interesting methods they had to pursue their cause?
There's so many. I mean, what I think of, especially when Judith was talking about the women who were the working class women on the Lower East Side involved in the labor movement, they would stand on soapboxes outside of factories, pleading with the men to vote, and then as the men would leave at the end of their working day. But they also endured a lot of abuse from standing on those soapboxes, and people telling them that they go home, throw things at them. It wasn't so easy to be standing. And also I remember, Melissa, I think in your book, didn't you have the example of somebody who was actually, like, her mother discovered she was standing outside a saloon? Yeah. People ended up in all kinds of interesting places. I also, in my book, Ballads, Babies, and Manners of Peace, I also have an example of a working class woman in Philadelphia, a young woman who just wanted to do something, but she had no money. So she bought a pound of peanuts, made peanut brittle out of it, and sold it as suffrage brittle outside the department store where she worked.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And most famously were the silent Sentinels, who, kind of created they stood outside of the White House and they held their signs, "How long, Mr. President, how long must we wait for liberty?" And really created a spectacle there. I mean, it caused a lot of distraction, and they were ultimately arrested and carted away and force-fed. And that in itself, also their resistance there in the jail also created quite a lot of tumult and press and attention. And they really knew how to make use of it. And the idea of placing yourself somewhere where you would get that attention and where politicians would have to pass by you and would have to address. I mean, and in general, there was a great sense of pageantry. You know, you think of the marches and people on horses and with banners and just a lot of, they had a very visual sense of what was going to make their presence felt.
And they also sold consumer items. There were washcloths that said votes for women on them. And another fun story is that Elva Belmont, who was very involved with the National Women's Party, an extremely wealthy woman, she was not Jewish, but she had a tea setting. She could serve tea to 200 women that said votes for women on it. And she lived in one of those mansions in Newport during the summer. And I always just had this vision of the scullery maids washing 200 dishes that say votes for women. What did they think about that? But there was actually a whole suffrage merchandising enterprise that was also going on.
And you can still buy some of those that set of china, of those teacups. I actually have a couple of those teacups at my house.
and also recipes. There's a new book coming out that has all the suffrage recipes.
The suffrage cookbook.
Yeah.
Well, we know food always sells in the world, and in the Jewish world in particular. So when Tennessee became the 36th state and finally, the ratification happened, the amendment passed, women didn't exactly flock to the polls. That was in August. The next presidential election was in November 1920, but they didn't flock to the polls. What happened?
In some cases, I think there was just there's obviously education that needs to happen for people to become voters, but you also have to remember that polling places were not places women had really spent a lot of time, right? They were places that were sort of coded as male. They were, in many cases, run by men. Women were often harassed there. In fact, one of the things that women did when they sort of realized that they wanted women to be able to feel free to vote and to protect them was to set up sort of watchers, female watchers, who would be there as kind of almost like chaperones in some ways to make sure that women weren't going to be harassed, because there was still often this sense of kind of resentment against women that, the ones who were going to vote were somehow trying to take over, male roles. And there are interesting articles. In fact, we wrote a little bit about this at JWA. A writer for the Yiddish press, Miriam Karpelov, wrote some very interesting articles for the Jewish press about her accounts of watching at the polls and what it was like seeing women come in and be really nearly assaulted by men there and kind of catcalled and pushed around, and what the ways that women tried to overcome that by going together in groups and bringing people with them, all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't an immediately safe feeling space, I think, for some women.
So it took a little while.
Especially in the states where women had not been voting, right? There were many states where women had voted in various levels of elections, and there were states where women had been enfranchised for a long time. But the places that were totally new to women at the polls, that brought down the numbers in that first election in 1920. They just, and remember, even though the suffrage movement was a mass movement by the time it finally succeeded, it took a long time because it wasn't just men who opposed suffrage. There were lots of women who were either in opposition or ambivalent at best. And from August to November was not enough time for an educational campaign to convince all those people. The numbers did actually go up in 1924 for the presidential election, and I think that's worth pointing out.
Well, I think the other thing to remember is that in 1920, more than half of the Jews living in America were immigrants. And so the women among them, and as well as the men, they don't really quite understand what's going on, and they need to be educated. I know the National Council of Jewish Women gets involved with this, printing pamphlets in Yiddish and teaching classes about, how to vote, what it means to be a citizen of the United States. So it's not, for the Jewish community, it's not automatic at that point.
I'm going to go to some of the questions. We have some good questions in the Q&A section. So back to some of the topics that we were talking about, but to expand a little bit, somebody asked, can you discuss the controversy about whether there was anti-Semitism on the part of Alice Paul? And I've also heard this too, some people suggesting that wasn't really true, and the militant suffragists. And also, what was the relationship of the Jewish suffragists with the Black community and Black suffragists?
Well, let me answer. I'll take the Alice Paul part. Alice Paul was definitely somebody who had the kind of, as Judith put it, the genteel anti-Semitism of her day, very clearly. And it's something that she was kind of an unreconstructed, quote unquote, genteel anti-Semite her entire life. I mean, and everybody knew it. I mean, there were a number of Jewish women involved in high up who worked very closely with her in the National Women's Party. People like Carolyn Katzenstein and Rebecca Auerwitz-Reher, and especially Anita Politzer, who was a very significant partner in the National Women's Party and lobbied for years for the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first brought to Congress in 1923 by the National Women's Party, by the quote unquote more militant section of what had been the suffrage movement. And they all knew it. And in fact, in oral histories that were done with suffragists who worked closely with Alice Paul in the 1960s, so we're talking about, this is the post-World War II, post-Holocaust set of oral histories, several of those women who weren't Jewish said to the interviewer, so have you heard that Alice Paul was an anti-Semite? She really was. And in fact, if you read Alice Paul's oral history by the same group, same team, she's still saying things that are not good. I mean, she's not like vicious, but she did stay stuck. So I think, she's not the worst anti-Semite ever to walk the earth, but it was definitely part of her politics, and that had an impact not just on the National Women's Party and the ERA movement, but also the peace movement that she was involved in, that she was also very involved in after World War I and after suffrage. And so, it's unfortunate, but as we know, and certainly there's a lot of public discussion about this today, plenty of people who are heroes in some ways are flawed in many, many others. And it's very important to keep it in mind.
Yeah. And how did Anita Politzer become, her right-hand person? How did she become so close? Did she just, ignore that, or she didn't care, or?
I think it was a cause that she believed in. And so she was working for the cause. The same thing was true for Rebecca Auerwitz-Reher, a less known, but somebody who should be better known, who was also a longtime colleague of Alice Paul. And she knew it too, but she just, they believed in the cause, and that was more important than any individual to them.
Mm-hmm. And Judith, do you want to go back to that other piece of the question? You talked a little bit about the racism, but was there any relationship between the Black suffrage activists and the Jewish ones?
I don't know of explicit, as such relationship between the Black suffrage community and the Jewish suffrage community. I'm sure there were some places where there was crossover, but Black suffragists in large part didn't participate very much in some of the mainstream suffrage movements because of racism, and because they had their own organizations that they were building on, similar to how Jews were bringing their suffrage activism into other organizations, their clubs and organizations like NCJW. That was true in the Black community too. So, I don't know very much, maybe Melissa knows more from her research about, I haven't encountered sort of explicit, formal attempts to bring together Blacks and Jews around the suffrage movement.
We have a couple questions related to the international world. Pam, you touched on what was going on in what was then Palestine. We have a question. It seems that women in England were ahead of those in the U.S. in terms of suffrage. Were any of them Jewish, and did they influence events in the U.S. at all? And also, just generally, were there more voting? Was there more activism and voting in other countries that any of you are aware of?
There was an international women's suffrage movement, and the Union for Equal Rights for Women in the Land of Israel, they actually joined that movement. They're one of the first. So this is a place where you see Jews in the Jewish community in Palestine joining a national movement, actually before men in Palestine, Jewish men in Palestine do that. But there were certainly women involved in suffrage in England, but I really don't know of any particular cases. Maybe Lily Montagu was involved with that. I'm not positive. I don't know. Maybe Melissa knows or Judith knows. I'm not aware of that. But we certainly see Jewish women who are involved in demanding women's rights all over Europe. In Germany, in Russia, what becomes the Soviet Union, they're working for female equality.
I actually wouldn't say that England was really ahead of there was a larger militant group in England, and there were Jewish women kind of across the spectrum. And the thing that England did have and no other country had was an explicitly Jewish suffrage organization, which did not happen in the United States. There was a small. But remember, the community in England is smaller and less vocal. in a lot of ways and stayed that way for quite a long time. But in England, women didn't get the right to vote on the national level in England until after World War I either, and then it was more limited than in the United States. At first, it was limited by age. There was a whole debate about property rights, so it wasn't necessarily faster in England. There are other countries that enfranchise women more graciously a little bit earlier. But in most of the Western world, women got the right to vote around the same time, not the exact same moment, but around the same time. And there were Jewish women involved in the International Women's Suffrage Association. Certainly there were American Jewish women who went to those conferences. Maud Nathan, as we mentioned, Hannah Greenebaum Solomon, who was the first president of the National Council of Jewish Women. But the international women's movement that Jewish women really got involved with was the peace movement, and to some degree the birth control movement as well, kind of following on from the suffrage movement.
The one questioner asked, were there any prominent Jewish men involved in the suffrage movement? One of the images we ran in the magazine was this sea of women in their white dresses standing on the steps of the Capitol. You're probably all familiar with it. And there were, maybe 2 or 3 men that you could pick out in that sea. Were there any prominent Jewish men among those?
Well, the Central Conference of American Rabbis goes on record. That's the Rabbinical Association for Reform Rabbis. They go on record endorsing suffrage, but they do it very, very late. So there were certainly many prominent men who were members of that.
So they did it, whereas the women's Jewish organizations didn't endorse, but were they the only Jewish organization that actually endorsed?
I don't know if they were the only Jewish organization, but they have a resolution, but it's really late. It's maybe 1917, 1918.
Interesting.
Stephen Wise, who was probably one of the most prominent American rabbis, was actively pro-suffrage, as was his assistant rabbi, Sidney Goldstein. There was a rabbi named Edward Israel. These are, they're kind of the usual suspects. These are progressive, politically progressive rabbis who basically support all progressive politics of varying kinds, so it's not surprising to see them. So there were rabbis who, across the country, who invited women to come speak and address their congregations about suffrage from the pulpit, which in many cases was the first time women had addressed the congregation from the pulpit. So there was, organizational, institutional support for suffrage as well.
And then you have some of the family members, like Maud Nathan's husband was a very big suffragist as well. And so we might assume that, certainly I'm sure there were families where that was not the case, but for many of these families of some of the really prominent Jewish women, they were traveling a lot, they were on the road, they were working really hard, and it would have been hard for them to do that without support within their families.
So the opposite of that, we have a question, did any men order their wives not to vote in 1920 that you're aware of?
It's hard to know.
Yeah, but there must have been. I'm sure. If it's not Jewish men, I am sure that there were Christian men in America who told their wives that they cannot vote.
Right.
And I'm sure that and probably some of them listened, and plenty of them went to the polls anyway.
Exactly.
And there were probably some men who told their wives who to vote for, and some of their wives followed them, and some of them didn't.
Yeah.
Right.
Gotta love a secret ballot.
Exactly. That was one of the things that was one of the arguments against suffrage was that, well, it's not going to be meaningful because women will just vote for whoever their husbands vote for. And so it'll double the electorate, but it's not going to meaningfully change the electorate. But women knew better.
So it turns out that argument is wrong. And so is the argument that all women would vote the same way, that there would be some kind of women's bloc. But there were so many things that divided American women: religion, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was never anything like a woman's bloc.
Right. And somebody else asked, is there any demographic data providing numbers of women per religion? So how many Jewish women were there compared to other faiths? Any sense of that? Probably hard to know, right?
Yeah.
Quantitative data is usually very difficult to come by and often suspect when you find it. So.
Right. So I want to know, so where did all that energy go? I recently watched the Hulu series Mrs. America, which, was a fabulous depiction of the fight for and against the Equal Rights Amendment and the, beginnings of the second wave of the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s. But what happened between 20 and the 60s and 70s? Was there activism? Was there a Jewish role there? What was going on?
Absolutely. There were a million movements that were happening, and Jewish women were involved in pretty much all of them. So Melissa already mentioned some of them, right? The peace movement, the birth control movement, We have the civil rights movement. Obviously, there's the battle for the ERA, which, as Melissa said, starts really right after the suffrage amendment is ratified. So there's so many ways that Jewish women are involved in all of those different kinds of movements. And still, labor activism is still a hotbed for many decades after.
But what doesn't happen is women entering into electoral politics. So we all know that there's one Jewish woman who's elected to Congress, national electoral politics, one Jewish woman, Florence Prague-Kahn, who's elected to her husband's seat when he dies. But I think it's really important that we should remember that this week is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Bella Abzug. And when Bella Abzug was elected to Congress in 1970, she was one of 15 women sworn in alongside 520 men. And 2% of the Congress of the United States was female at that point. So it really takes a long time for American women to enter into the political process. And so while they're involved in these other social movements that Judith and Melissa have been talking about, they don't move, and it's American women, it's not just Jewish women, they don't move into elected politics for a very long time.
And part of that, I think, is the legacy of the suffrage movement. In other words, it took so long to get the right to vote that women, and again, not just Jewish women, developed many other ways to be political. Voting is incredibly important. Everybody should go and vote. But it's not the only way to be political or to get things done. Right? So women accomplished a tremendous amount. And it used to be, the narrative of American women's history used to say, women got the right to vote in 1920. Dead stop. Then Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963. Well, that period used to be called the doldrums, but historians, we don't think about it that way anymore. There was a tremendous amount of energy and reform activism and real change being made between, during those decades. It's just not the case that women kind of got the right to vote and went home and closed the door, maybe coming out every 4 years to vote. And Jewish women were incredibly involved in that, as were their organizations. So, for instance, the National Federation for Temple Sisterhoods is one of the most important peace players in the world, right? And really, literally, in the worldwide movement. And then they get involved with the anti-nuclear movement in the early 1960s. It's just one of many examples that we can give. So, and Hadassah, of course, is another example. Look at what Hadassah women were accomplishing throughout that period, not through electoral politics, but raising enormous amounts of money, basically founding the educational and public health systems of what would become the state of Israel. I mean, they accomplished all these things, that's political, even if it's not electoral.
Where does the word suffrage come from? Anybody know that? That's a question that we have here.
I don't know.
I feel like we should know the answer to that.
Right, yeah. I don't know. Have to.
Well, I think it's in some ways, and I heard a scholar talking about this recently, that, it's a sort of a shame we use that word because it sounds so antiquated, and it kind of separates our understanding of activism around voting rights in the period of the suffrage movement and activism around voting rights after that period and now, right? Instead of seeing that all as a continuum of a constant attempt to really expand and improve democracy in this country, we see it as like the suffrage movement. It ends in 1920, right? And not understanding that it's actually an ongoing movement for voting rights, and that we're not done. It's not over. It's not a finished revolution. So sometimes I think language can distance us from history and make something seem like it's, unrelated to the world that we live in, when in fact there is a great deal of continuity there.
Well, we're running out of time here, so we've touched on it a little bit in terms of the legacy, but I want to come back to that. What would you say is the most significant legacy of the suffrage movement, whether that's a good term or not? And in terms of serving as a model, both for activism in times after that, or moving into the political realm as candidates, politicians, voters, what was the legacy?
For me, the legacy was that if you really look at the suffrage movement, which emerges at the time that we begin to use the word feminism, the way we think of feminism as advancing women's rights, suffrage becomes one pillar in what is a very broad-based, what becomes a very broad-based movement to expand the rights for women in the United States. It's not, it was a symbol, and a very important symbol. And it's really shocking when you think that, in this nation that was established in 1776, women have only been voting for 100 years. But as Judith was talking about, it's part of a long struggle over the question of voting rights. But more importantly, it's a question for women to control access to their own property. It's a question for women to have access to all areas of the economy and the professions. Suffrage is just one small part of this struggle for equal rights for American women.
I think also when I think about the legacy of the suffrage movement, I just think about the incredible perseverance of activists who worked for decades, generations really. That kind of just long-term commitment and thinking and strategizing and kind of tireless work. And I think there's just a lot to learn from that. I think we're very, we're very impatient and we want to see change right away. And that unfortunately isn't often how things work. Sometimes it takes coming at things from many different, with many different strategies, sometimes different strategies simultaneously, trying different approaches. And when we look at the suffrage movement over its whole history, there were, multiple different versions of amendments or different strategies, whether it's going by state or going by a federal amendment, and just kind of different ways of doing it. And but people stuck with it. And, I think that I take a lot of strength and inspiration from that, just deep commitment and perseverance.
I think, sorry I disappeared for a minute. I got knocked off the call, so apologies to everybody. I think for Jewish women also there was this legacy of, we should take our newfound political power, electoral or not, and take it back to our communities. So we see one of the things that you see right after the 19th Amendment is passed is that Jewish women in congregations across the denominations, all over the United States, go back to their synagogues and say, yeah, you have to let us on the board now. Or, we want more of a say. We are part of this community. If we can vote for the United States president, we should be able to vote for, what goes on in our synagogue communities. And that happens everywhere across the United States. And in general, I think Jewish women feel empowered by this movement that they were a part of, not the driving force of, but were an important part of, especially in areas that had large Jewish communities. And they want to see change in their local, internally as well as kind of externally. And that's an important legacy, I think, for Jewish women in particular who worked for so long in the suffrage movement, that they could then try to make change at home as well.
The first bat mitzvah was in 1922, and it was clearly a legacy of Mordecai M. Kaplan and his daughter's interest in the suffrage movement.
Well, thank you all so much for really just a fascinating, insightful, and important conversation. And for all of our audience, thank you for joining us. If you're not yet a member of Hadassah, please feel free to become one. You'll get regular notices about all of our online programs, like future Hadassah Magazine discussion clubs, our recently launched One Book, One Hadassah National Book Group, all sorts of topics, at-home exercises, classes, cooking demonstrations, Hebrew lessons, and more. Annual membership is only $36 and include many benefits, including a subscription to Hadassah Magazine. So please feel free to connect. Go to hadassah.org/connect. So thank you so much, all of you, for participating, for joining us, for our wonderful panelists. It's really been a pleasure. Melissa, Pam, and Judith, thank you so much, and stay safe and be well, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.